I'd like to open with a chant, and this chant is about water, the water of life, the water of Hane. So I want you to listen to it and feel the vibrations, and I'll tell you what it means after. It has to do with this talk. E aka hue vai olono, e vai a ke akua, e ola no ka aina, kanua kupu, kupu a ulu vehi vehi, lupa lupa kalau, mahua ua ka ai, e ola. E ora I ka vehilani. Oh, Mama. So, this chant, Eya kabaya kane, there is the waters of Kane. Eya ka hue vai o lono, there are the waters of the container that Lono holds for that water. E vai a ke akua, God's water. E ola no ka aina, that feeds and gives life to the land. Kanua kupu, plant the seeds, plant the offshoots, plant the new growth. Kupu a ulu vehi vehi, so that there can be abundance, but it also means let there be enthusiasm to bring that kupu. And kupu also, it's a funny word, it also means spirit. So we're having this sense of growth, but also the growth that comes from spirit. The language is rich if you look deeper into the meaning. So this water is watering the earth, and the earth, if you plant the seeds, will grow abundantly from that water, from that source. Right. And then there is mahuahua ka'ai, there's plenty of food coming from that seed. And then eola no kavehilani, so that there can be life from the heavenly abundance. Everything is coming from that spirit. And there's lots of it, if we can just believe and plant the seeds and water them with the waters of life. That's our beliefs, our trust in spirit.
Mahalo, mahalo. Man, that was beautiful. Did she ever say her name? Okay. This is Susan Paini'u Floyd. She's one of our senior teachers. She teaches hula and lomi lomi, and she teaches Huna, this philosophy that we're teaching tonight, and she's the head of our halau, okay, our hula halau. Okay. Thank you, Susan. My background, because there's a lot of people here who are new and may not be that familiar with me, my father was adopted by a Hawaiian family from the island of Kauai. The family's name was Kahili. Joseph Kahili adopted my father as his son when my father was a young man. A long time after that, when my father died, I was contacted by the Kahili family, because my father had been training me in the same knowledge. Joseph Kahili adopted me as his grandson and turned me over to the people who became my Hawaiian auntie and my Hawaiian uncle. And then they trained me for quite a number of years. I also have a background in Africa. I was trained by an African shaman for 7 years there, and worked and studied with Mongolian shamans, but my home and heart is from Hawaii. Okay? So, with that said, let's begin with what I like to do. I like to begin with a story. And the story I've picked for tonight comes from Kauai. It's actually from the book More Kauai Tales by Fred Wickman, who is a master storyteller and has immense, rich store of knowledge of the stories of Kauai. So tonight's story is from Kauai. I may have to refer to a few notes here because I don't have the thing memorized yet. But once upon a time, a long time before Captain Cook, now that's a frequent way of designating how long old something was, and there was a lot more communication between human beings and animals at that time. Other than that, human beings were just about the same as they are today. On the evening of our story, after the farmers in the area, in the land, had gone back to their grass huts down by the shore, why Iole, who was rat, and Moakane, rooster, they got together in the evening and sat down by the ocean and had a nice long chat. And one of the things they chatted about was these two farmers that they knew. Now, it helps to understand that at this time, most of the Hawaiians lived near the sea. Not right on the beach, but close to the sea. And when they had to go to work, why the fishermen would go off into the ocean to do their fishing, and the farmers would usually go some ways up into the upland to do their farming. So the fields were separate. They also did not live in villages, but they had separate individual households that were scattered all around. So the farmers they're talking about, one of them, that day, as a matter of fact, when Rat and Rooster were talking, the farmer's name was Nihi Nihi, and he had been throwing stones at them to chase them out of his fields. And so they had gone to the fields of another farmer called Kahiau, and there they just ate to their fill, and they were very satisfied, and they were talking about the differences. Nihi Nihi was a very careful farmer. He did everything right. He had walls around his house that were made of stone and perfectly square. He had a platform up on a ridge where he did his farming, okay, all very well taken care of. He did all the prayers and all the rituals that he could find to help make his farming, his crops a success. He went out every day into his fields and found the insects and crushed and killed everyone that he could find. If he saw any birds or other animals, why, he would chase them out all the time. He weeded all the time. He did everything carefully. He planted on the right day in the right season, at the right time. And he was always very careful. And by very careful farming, he was able to provide for his family for the whole year. Okay? That's all he provided for. But he was able to provide for his family. He was also very careful to pay his taxes. The kind of tax system they had was the konohiki, who was like the of this area. This was in the area of Waimea in southern Kauai. The konohiki was something like a landlord who worked for the high chief, but he was the one that gathered the taxes in the form of food and goods that the people produced. So Nihi was always careful to pay just the right amount of taxes in food for the konohiki. Now, in big contrast to that was Kahiau. And Kahiau, he was a dreamer. I mean, he was a farmer, sure, but farming took second place, third place, fourth place. He loved to make chants, he loved to chant, he loved to sing, he loved to dance. He would do this all and share it with the neighbors. He didn't do much with his farm. His farm was down in the lower lands than Nihi Nihi's, but it looked more like a jungle, actually, than a farm. And he really didn't take too much care about when he planted everything at the same time, and everything grew and ripened at the same time. And so when there was this big excess, why, he'd just call all his neighbors together and have a big feast to eat up the extra. He also didn't care much about the insects and the birds and the chickens and things like that. He just didn't pay attention to them unless he wanted to sit for a while, and in a very appreciative way, why, he would look at their movements, and sometimes he'd create dances and chants based on their movements. And Kahiao in the neighborhood was very famous for his rat dance and his chicken dance. Okay, but that's the kind of guy that he was when in dealing with all the farms. Now, came some time when the Konohiki announced a contest that all the farmers had to participate in. And the contest was to grow the biggest sweet potato. And all the farmers had to participate or they'd lose their farms. So that was the contest. And they were given, of course, the right amount of time in which to do this. And something you ought to know, the way sweet potatoes were at that time. First of all, the people who investigate this kind of thing, biologists, I guess, say that the sweet potato originally came from South America, which is very interesting because it was all over Polynesia and it was all over Asia too. So it's very probable, we know what the hukulea can do, the Polynesians went over to South America, got it, liked it, and shared it with Asia. That's the most likely way that happened. At any rate, at the time we're talking about, there were about 24 varieties of sweet potato. The sweet potato was called uala. And the way they grew them was by cuttings. So they would take cuttings from the older plant, they would make a little mound called a pu'e, and they'd take a digging stick and they'd poke 3 holes in it. And then they'd put the cuttings in there, and of course then they'd water it and care for it from that point on. So when the contest was announced, Nihi went right out and he cleared some land of all the weeds and all the plants and everything else, so he had a lot of space, and he built a lot of mounds, and he stuck 3 slips or cuttings into each one of those, and he watered them and he cared for them and he weeded them every day, and he kept all the insects and other creatures away from them, and he really went into it. He was determined he was going to win this contest. Did I tell you what the prize was for winning the contest? I probably didn't say that. The prize for winning the contest was to have the person who won would have their choice of the new taro fields that were going to be opened up. Okay, so that was very valuable. So that's what Nihi did to prepare for this. And in the process, what he would do would be every time he went out, he would search for what potatoes were growing, and he'd reach into the mounds and pull out all the small ones and leave the big ones. And so the biggest ones would have more room to grow, and he kept doing this until finally he ended up with a really huge sweet potato. It was so big that it was kind of pushing up through the ground. Okay, and it was a one big sweet potato. So meanwhile, Kahiao, when he heard that he had to plant sweet potatoes, he just shrugged his shoulders, and he went over and found a spot, and he built one mound and stuck 3 holes in it. And he took some slips of it's called a mohihi uala, which is a type of sweet potato that sometimes grows very big. Not always, but sometimes. So he just planted those 3 in there, gave it some water, and he sat and he talked to the sweet potato cuttings, and he told them exactly what he wanted them to do. And then he went and forgot about them. Right? So time went by. The sweet potato in Kahiao's garden or in his farm tried its best, but there were so many other plants and there were so many insects that it only could grow to a moderate size. So the time was coming closer and closer to the sweet potato contest. About this time, just the night before, actually it was the day before when they had the idea, Rat got a very idea that he thought was very clever. And so they decided he went over to get his friend Rooster, and Rooster just crowed with laughter when he told him the idea. So what they did that night was they quietly went into Kahiao's farm, and they found one clear spot that existed. And they built a mound and prepared it. But they actually had to build a big mound with a kind of a big hole. And then they quietly sneaked up to the garden of Nihi. And with great care, with Rooster using his claws and his feet to dig away the ground, and Rat going down in and carefully nudging all the roots and the tubers, they finally rolled this uala down the hill very slowly and finally got it to Kahiao's place and put it in the hole and covered it up and put the roots in and everything like it. looked like it was there, always there. Okay. So, next morning, Nihi gets up, goes out into his field. They also kind of leveled his hill, okay? And so he went into his field. Where's his sweet potato? What happened? He couldn't imagine anything. And then right about that time, Kahiao was wandering into his garden, into his field, and gave a great cry of surprise. So Nihi comes rushing, because he got suspicious, and comes rushing down the hill to Kahiao's farm, and there's Kahiao standing in front of a big sweet potato that he didn't even remember planting. And Nihi says, "That's my sweet potato." And Kahiao says, "Well, you know, I'm kind of sorry, but the sweet potatoes walk. It's growing in my garden. It's got to be my sweet potato." And Nihi got really angry, and he decided to go and get the konohiki to come in and settle the matter. So while he was gone doing that, Kahiao looked around, and there in his jungle, he saw 4 eyes staring at him. And he looked closer, and it was Rat and Rooster standing side by side. And he looked at him and he said, "Did you guys do this?" And Rooster crowed, and Rat squeaked, and Kahiao said, "Mahalo, thank you." Okay? So then here comes the konohiki and Nihi, and so they come up, and first thing Nihi says, of course, "That's my sweet potato." And the konohiki looks at it, and he says, "Is this a walaka'a?" Which means a rolling sweet potato, like a traveling sweet potato. Does this sweet potato go wandering around all the place? That sweet potato was growing in the ground in Kahiao's garden. It must be his. So no matter what Nihi tried to do, Kahiao ended up winning the contest. And so when he won the contest, then he got the fields, you know, the choicest fields, and he found some other people to do the work for him, you know, for a good share of the crop. So he didn't have to bother with that. He got half of the sweet potato, half he had to give to the konohiki, and he got half of the sweet potato, and so he couldn't eat all that, so he called everybody in and had a big feast. Nihi didn't go. And so everybody enjoyed that, and Kahiao just went on doing his chanting and his singing most of the time, and he would sit and contemplate the beauty of nature and compose more chants about that beauty, and he always had more than enough to spare. And he always put a special little bonus aside for rats and roosters. Okay? And that's our story. Okay? Now, the topic for this evening has to do with spirituality and prosperity, and how you can possibly have both at the same time. Well, there's some clues in the story. Now, in the stories, in Hawaiian stories, to get more out of them, if you know the names of people that are talked about in the stories, that gives you a lot more information. And Nihi is a name that refers to somebody who goes overboard in being very proper about everything. And mainly because that kind of a person is very worried about what might happen if he isn't. And he's worried about the future, and he's worried about how things are going to be, so he tries to do everything he can to control the situation. Kahiao is a kind of a rare word, but what it means is, in Hawaiian, somebody who gives generously without any thought of return. Okay? Just gives from their heart. Okay? And that's what Kahiao did. And he had all this abundance. Okay? And the one who was trying to control it all had just enough to support his family and not share with anybody or anything. So I think the way that we're going to go into this is to explain it a little more. In this knowledge, we have something that we call the 7 principles. 7 principles of Huna. Sometimes we call it the aloha philosophy. These were 7 ideas that my Hawaiian uncle gave me, and in the form of 7 words, and sometimes in the form of proverbs and stories. But when I wanted to teach people in the Western world who have a background of Western education, what I did was find an essence of these ideas and turn it into a phrase that would be easier to remember. Now you got to understand this. Let's suppose we take one word called Ike. So I took one meaning of Ike. So Ike is something like a bit of ocean with all this depth to it. And what I've created here is something that people can see, which is a few waves on the surface. If you ever want to, you can go plunge into it much more deeply, but those waves on the surface are extremely useful. Right? And so that's what we teach mostly to begin with. So let's look at it from the ideas of these principles and the statements that I formed them into. So the first one is that the world is what you think it is. So we have two things to deal with here in this evening. One is what you think spirituality is, and one is what you think prosperity is. Right? And settling these kinds of things is a very, very important part of being able to be spiritual and prosperous. Now, in the terms we're talking about, which are fundamentally based on Hawaiian culture, kahiao represented the idea of spirituality. That spirituality has to do with love. It doesn't have to do with denying or ignoring the material world. In the old Hawaiian ideas, they had no concept of a separation between the spirit and material. They knew the difference, but they weren't separate. There were things in this world that were invisible, and there were things in this world that were visible, that you could handle, that you could touch. But all these things shared the same world. There were other places that you could go to, just like here, we can go to the mainland or Asia or someplace else, but it was all part of this big world. It wasn't separate, they were not opposites. And spirituality was how you acted, how you behaved toward other beings in this world. Because remember, other beings in the story, Kahiao talked to the plants. He treated them as living beings. He talked to the animals and treated them as equals. Spirituality had to do with aloha. Spirituality had to do with love. Prosperity means, if we really look at it, and you don't even have to think of this in just in Hawaiian terms, in any reasonable terms, prosperity means having enough to share. It does not mean having enough to do everything you want to do, because that's never ending. You'd have to own everything in the entire universe, because once you got enough to do what you wanted to do today, tomorrow you'd think of something else you wanted to do, and you'd have to get more and more and more. That's not really prosperity. Prosperity is having enough to share. The less you have, the less you have to share. The more prosperous you are, the more abundance you have in your life, the more you can share and the more other people you can help. So looking at this one, being spiritual and prosperous means having as much as you can have so that you can share it with as many others as possible. And you got to understand this part of it too, which is very important. Sharing with others does not mean not having any yourself. Because if you're not sharing with yourself, you're separating yourself from the rest of the world. And there is no real separation, so that doesn't make a lot of sense. This brings us into the second idea, which is based on a word called kala. And one of the meanings of kala is forgiveness. It also means to release all the ties of the past, but it also has to do with connection. So we basically look at this as kala means that everything is connected, that there are no limits is the way we usually phrase it. And we look at that in two ways. One, I already mentioned, everything is connected. Everything has an effect on everything else. But the second part is the universe is infinite. Now, this is a way of looking at the world, admittedly, but wow, the effects of looking at the world this way are very profound. The universe is unlimited. This assumes this idea that the universe is infinite. Now, here we have to really realize something that a lot of people miss. If the universe is infinite, if we accept that idea, then we must accept the idea that everything in it is infinite. That means material goods, and that means people. That people are also infinite. That means love is infinite. And that means all the good things that we would like to have and that we would like to share are infinite in this point of view. If we don't accept this and we treat the world as lost, like some people call the Earth, the spaceship Earth, they call it. What an extremely limited viewpoint of this incredibly powerful living planet. Right? If we can look at it that way, and if we do, we're going to immediately look in terms of limitation. We're going to be like Nihi, and we're going to be very careful with our resources, and we're going to make sure that we don't run out of things, and we're going to put rules and regulations and strictures, and finally it's who can have what, and we can only have so much to share. There's a different way of looking at the world, and different things happen when we look at the world that way. We suddenly find that there's always more. There's always enough, unless individual people have limited their thinking. And that's where loss and lack start to come in, okay? And by expanding the thinking, by doing an extremely daring thing, which is trust the universe, and by whatever name you want to give that, stuff starts to change. It's not easy if you've been brought up to look at the whole life in terms of limitation. To tell you, I know that from personal experience. I went through times in my family when we had less than nothing. We were dependent on others for our clothing and for our food. In my blood family, we had times when the children had to have cast-off clothing. I can remember vividly when I was about 14 or 15, in order to have a meal, sometimes I'd have to go in the backyard. We were living on someone else's farm at this time, and they had corn cribs. And I'd have to go and gather the leavings of the corn that was at the bottom of the crib and take a hammer and mash it into flour so we'd have something on the table. And that was all due to, at that time, this a period of very limited thinking that we all went through in my family. It took me quite a long time to get out of that. And more as I got out of that, I found that by acting more like Kahiyao, by being more and more generous, by giving away more and more things freely, that more and more things were there to give away. And so some of the people, in the same profession, my profession, where I earn my living from, is as a writer. And some of my fellow writers think I'm totally nuts because I give away so much of my writing. Right? And with articles and these booklets, and we give booklets on healing and love that we give out all over the world in 22 different languages, totally free. We mail them out, we put them on the internet in 22 languages, and people can download them and put it out there. And it expands. And every person that does it and reads it and uses it increases this whole idea and this idea of something there for everyone. So that's the idea that there's no limits. Next idea is energy flows where attention goes. I'm going to put that in this context in a little different way. Focus on what you want and not on what you don't want. Now, why is that? Well, we can look at this in two ways. We can look at it metaphysically and say that when you are focusing on what you don't want, which is a negative thing, you'll attract negative things into your life. And when you focus on the good things you want, you'll attract good things in your life. I wish it were that easy. I really were. It's not easy to focus only on what you want and what you don't want, but even when you're good at that, there's a little more to it. We can look at this in a practical way. My training is as a psychologist, and I can look at this in the psychological way that we call first level thinking, because if you start focusing on what you want instead of on what you don't want, two very important things happen. Your mind starts looking for ways to get what you want instead of avoiding what you don't want. So your behavior changes. Right? And not only that, but your physical behavior changes. Because every time you're thinking about what you don't have, you can, ways of testing this, your physical body tenses up. And if you're constantly thinking on what's wrong or what you don't have, then you create more and more tension in your body. Your thinking becomes fuzzy and your body function becomes in trouble. Right? So just from that point of view, whichever viewpoint we want to take, it still works. It's something you have to practice and learn how to do to keep bringing your focus back. I'll come up with that in another thing. So the next thing is, now is the moment of power, based on the word manawa, which also means feelings. But now is the moment of power. Now, if we look at this one, so many of us, because of the nature of our language and our training, are really concerned about the past and the things that happened in the past. And sometimes we think that what happened to us in the past is giving us all the limitation that we have today, is a reason why we may be angry or not as loving and generous as we could be, is a reason why we don't have the opportunities that we could have had if only things had been different. This is a very radical concept, this one I'm presenting right now, based on the Hawaiian language. See, the Hawaiian language has no past tense. In the ancient times, when they were not influenced by Western education, the Hawaiians, when they spoke, were always speaking in the present. And they did not celebrate any anniversaries. The only one they did celebrate one, the first anniversary of the eldest child, the first birthday of the eldest child, Hiapo. Other than that, no birthdays. Before 1778, nobody has a clue about any date. Everything is total guesswork. Because they just didn't keep records, they didn't keep histories, they weren't concerned with that. They maintained genealogies because they were concerned with that, but not because it was the past, but because of what it said about the person able to recite that genealogy in the present. They kept legends and stories of events, not because they happened in the past, but for what they could teach and the people who were living today. For instance, the story I just told you. Okay? I told you a very short version. If I were teaching that in the old style, we could be up all night as I carefully taught you exactly how to plant sweet potatoes, exactly how to weed them, probably throw in some things about fishing and how they make up digging stick, and because that's how the old stories were told. Okay? So now is the moment of power. The past, for practical purposes, doesn't exist. The lack that you may have experienced, the reasons for that you think now or why you are the way you are today, got nothing to do with the past. Just to let you know, one way that I say that is you cannot get wet from yesterday's rain, you cannot get burned by tomorrow's sun. The only thing you have to deal with are memories of the past, and that's where the problem is. Those memories exist now. You can change your relationship to those memories and undo all the things you think were limiting you. I do not promise that any of this is easy. I promise it's simple, but not necessarily easy. But it can be done, and done more easily when you're only working with memories, instead of an actual big past hanging out there that you can't do anything about. So let's go to the next one, which happens to be aloha, based on the word aloha. If we translate the roots of this word, we come up with an idea that says to love is to be happy with someone or something. Okay? How can you be happy with your present state? Well, I'm going to give you a huge secret. One of the easiest ways to change your present state is to say, okay, this is my present state, so what? Okay? That's not exactly happiness, but it's a lot more than trying to resist it. The more you resist what's going on, the harder it is to change it. The more you can just let it be, which is tolerance, which is part of aloha, and just let it be and start making changes, no matter how small, towards something you love, for someone you love, perhaps, the easier it becomes, because you're not pushing through all of that resistance. Right? So it's kind of a radical idea, but there's a lot of radical ideas when we compare them to a lot of the usual ideas. But this is the idea of love. And love in Hawaiian, the aloha, has to do with sharing. Because one of the meanings of one of the words, alo, is to share an experience. And so if you have an experience of prosperity, it means share it. Okay? It doesn't mean share it or else. That doesn't work. That's doing it out of fear because you're afraid you might lose something or be hurt or something like that. It's sharing because you feel like sharing and you trust that there'll be more. The next one is, not the last one yet, but the next one is something called mana, based on that word mana. Now, mana is a very misunderstood word. It's translated usually as energy. It doesn't mean energy at all. It's not some mysterious fluid that permeates the universe like some anthropologists think. It's very simple. Mana means influence. Sometimes it's translated as authority, but that's because authority has influence. Mana is the influence that someone or something has on the world around them. At its best, it comes from within. So we say all power comes from within, essentially. You can pretend somebody or something else has power over you, but you're giving it the power when you do that. So the power for spirituality, to be more spiritual, which means in this sense to be more loving and generous, to be more prosperous, which means doing what you can to increase what you can share and enjoy what you have also at the same time. That power comes from inside of you, comes from choice, comes from decision. You can't control the world. There's no way to control an infinite universe. It's not controllable. Nihi tried to control his world, and it ended up with loss, and it ended up with a minimum of what he could possibly get. Control doesn't work. Influencing does work. We can influence events, we can influence behavior, we can influence ourselves to change, to try new things, to be not afraid of risk, not to be stupid, but to be not afraid of risk. Okay? All of that power comes from within. That's our mana. Okay? And how many other people we can help to make happy. One of the ideas that we teach is that the purpose of life is not what most people think. The purpose of life, why we're all here, the way we've been designed, and there's tremendous evidence to support this, we've been designed to have a good time. We've been designed to learn how to party really, really well. We have the capacity for singing and sharing and healing and enjoyment. Hardly anybody touches the possibilities of simple enjoyment. Okay? It's like sometimes we think of health. Oh, I'm healthy if I'm not sick. Okay? And so here it is right here, and down here is all the being sick, and we've made it this far. Wow, now I'm healthy because I'm not sick. Whoa, there's a big universe up above that. And it's the same with prosperity. There's no law of the universe says you're only allowed to have so much. How can you not have more to share with others and party really well? We have this potential for pleasure and sharing pleasure, which goes largely untapped. And so that's why we put that focus on it. That's our purpose here. We have been designed to enjoy life. If we don't, it's no one else's fault but ours. Okay? The last one says that effectiveness is the measure of truth. Effectiveness is the measure of truth. Many people have a little trouble with that. It's based on the word pono. Pono is usually used as a word that means good. It can also mean prosperity and success. Fundamentally, it means goodness, but it also has the meaning of result. And so we're talking about, basically, a good result. And so we look at, there may be an abstract truth, there may be an absolute truth. So what? The only truth you're ever going to know is what you experience. So why don't we just go right straight to that? And in this sense, effectiveness is what we can see is true. So if you're trying to be more spiritual and you're trying to be more prosperous, try stuff. Try things. Try it out. People don't fail. Only plans fail. So if your plan isn't working, stop, take a look at it, and make a new plan. Do something different, that's all. Right? You don't have to be stuck in one way of trying to achieve anything, especially not in this area. There's always ways to share, there's always more ways to love, there's always more way to become more prosperous so that you can share and love more. I have to remind people of how much we use this already, because at first when they hear it, they think it's a kind of a strange idea. But one of the things I like to do to use this is to ask people, somebody here, what day this is. Okay? What's the date? Somebody give me the date.
5th of August.
5th of August. And what year?
2007.
Okay. According to who?
According to the calendar.
Yeah, according to which calendar? You see, there's dozens and dozens and more than that of calendars in the world. The Mayans have 17. Okay? We're just using the most popular calendar. It's not the only calendar. Okay? It's not even the most accurate calendar, if we think in those terms. Okay? It just happens to be the one that's most popular right now all over the world. And so we pretend that out of all the possibilities of nature, this particular day has a number within a certain month that doesn't bear any relationship to anything in the universe that we've created, okay? And that even the time that we pick, and we call this time whatever it is now, totally arbitrary, but it is so useful. It's useful to be able, all of us to be able to meet here at a particular time and stay together for a particular length of time. That's very useful. It's effective. And so we act like it's true. We do this in a lot of things in our life. Nothing wrong with that. Now I'm just talking about applying it to a different area of life also. Okay? And it helps to make you more, if you use it in this way, more spiritual, more prosperous, more to share, more to love. There are people who think that the purpose of life is to become one with the all so that you and the all are one. I have to tell you, from my tradition, we think that's a nice place to visit, but we don't want to live there, okay? Because if you're everything, you don't have any friends, okay? And life is so much less enjoyable. So we visit that space, but most of the time we stay where we can interact with people and with stars and with trees and with plants and rocks and flowers and life itself.